Hello and welcome. Her training and experience as a teacher took her to locations around the world where she discovered the dangers and devastating impact of landmines on the lives of ordinary, often poor people. And her tireless campaigning eventually paid off in the effort to ban the explosive devices. This week on One on One, meet the activist and Nobel Peace Laureate, Jody Williams.
She grew up in a time when young Americans were discovering the power of protest, when everything from the Vietnam War to women's rights were issues taken to the streets. And since then, Jody Williams has wanted her voice heard. Never standing still, she traveled the world highlighting causes such as the abuse of women and the danger of landmines. Her voice ended up loud enough to win her and the international campaign to ban landmines the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. Williams didn't see that as an excuse to sit back and take it easy. In 2006, she formed the Nobel Women's Initiative with some of her distinguished fellow sister laureates to take on causes such as human rights, highlighting the plight of their detained fellow laureate Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. More than 4 decades of activism later, Jody Williams is still going strong.
Jody Williams, I'm so pleased to have some time with you. Thank you.
It's nice to see you again.
My pleasure. Now, I've got to ask you about this expression you have, working as an activist for peace. You're very active, but you say working for peace is not for the faint-hearted. Mm-hmm. Why?
Because it's really hard work every day. I get sick of the notion of, peace being the rainbow and the dove and kumbaya, my lord. And I think those symbols and expressions are used to delegitimize what it really means to work for peace. I think it's hard work every single day. I mean, I think of what's going on in the Middle East right now. And I think of the, nonviolent action for democracy, however that it's defined there, but for freedom, for expression, for change. That is really brave. To stand up and, stand with other people who share your feelings and being willing to put yourself on the line to bring about change. That's not easy.
Now, of course, you do put yourself out there. You're out in places that are dangerous. You're questioning authority. You actually are challenging people who have power. To what degree does that make you a target too?
Well, I am frequently referred to as controversial. I've thought about it quite a bit of late because I'm trying to write a memoir, which is disgusting, but I am. And controversial comes to mind, and how I interpret that in regard to me is just that I don't care who you are. And I don't mean that in the nasty way it sounds, but I would speak to a president or a prime minister the same way I would speak to a colleague in the Landmine Campaign. I'm not going to change my beliefs, how I talk about them, in order to make some individual, with a title, happy. That's not what a grassroots activist does, in my view.
But you end up drawing attention to yourself, and I wonder, have you ever faced serious pressure, people trying to silence you?
Well, at different times in different ways. There was a little contention in the Landmine Campaign after the Peace Prize because, I received it individually along with the campaign. And there were some people in the campaign, unfortunately they were men, who tried to put me off as some sort of throwback hippie from the Vietnam era and not really understanding the sophistication of winning the prize and how I should handle myself. And I thought, terrific, we're recognized, but that doesn't, I'm me. I didn't change from yesterday to today. I'm still a grassroots activist who believes that I have a voice and I am going to use it. I had more difficulties when I worked in Central America during the 1980s, during the wars. That was tough.
Actually dangerous in those instances.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I had an unfortunate run-in with a member of a death squad one time. It was unpleasant.
Maybe we can touch on that, but I do want to see where you got to by going through your past, your history. And you were born in Brattleboro, is that how you say it?
I was actually born in Rutland, which is up the state, but I grew up the first 7 years of my life in a town of 1,200 people.
In Vermont?
In Vermont, where we had more cows than people at the time, and frankly, I thought it was terrific because cows are pleasant. They give you cheese and milk, they don't harass other cows. And I grew up believing all the mythologies about my country. And I say mythology both positively and negatively. I think any country has to build a mythology about the wonders of the nation, you know, America conquering the continent, and not wanting to note that there was a lot of genocide with the Native Americans in the process. But I grew up believing that the US really stood for self-determination for other nations. All of that stuff, you know, the Statue of Liberty, and my grandparents came from Scotland and Italy, you know. I believed that stuff.
How happy was your childhood? Was it, I mean, it was peaceful, obviously.
Well, yes and no. I had a brother who was born deaf, Steve. My mom had the German measles in the first trimester. And then he developed violent schizophrenia, you know, adolescent onset when he was in his teens. And it was dramatic. I mean, he was physically hostile toward my mom. He blamed her for, you know, all the other children can hear, what did you do to me, kind of thing. And I was the one who would stand up to him and push back.
I gather that was your first sort of real experience with empathy and activism in trying to defend him.
Yeah, kids in the neighborhood. There were a couple of neighbors, Billy and Bobby. And
we've named them.
Yeah, I didn't say their last name, though.
That's true.
Billy and Bobby. And they were really mean to my brother. And I couldn't understand it. He can't talk. It's not his choice he can't talk. It's not his choice he can't hear. Why do you want to, you know, make him more miserable than life has already made him in some ways? And one time they threw tin cans at us. We were riding bicycles, and one of them cut his scalp. And it bleeds a lot. The scalp bleeds a lot. So he understandably got really freaked out, turned his bicycle around and went back toward the house where my mother came out, hysterical Italian Catholic, you can imagine. And I jumped off my bike and tried to run up the hill and beat up Billy and Bobby. They escaped. But I would have thrashed them if I had gotten them, even though I did get the Peace Prize.
Now, you mentioned your mother. You were very close to her, weren't you?
My mom, I am, yeah. Both my parents, I mean, we're a very close family. My father died in 2004. They were married 58 years, so that's a little tough. But my mom, despite, you know, my brother lived with my parents their entire life. She's fun, she's funny, she's sharp, she's 80 and looks 65, and I'm not kidding. She is a blast to be with. I always love her.
What of their traits do you see in you? What characteristics did you get from each one?
Telling the truth is one. I can do a lot of things. I'm not a lovely human being. I didn't turn into Mother Teresa when I got the Peace Prize. I think I said it to you in our interview way back then. But I don't lie. I think it's a waste of time. And if you lie, you have to then try to remember what the lie was and how. It just seems stupid to me. But I got that from my parents. Believing that you are the equal of anybody else. The title is not important. You know, president, Nobel laureate, whatever. It's the quality of the actions you take during your life to make the world a better place. And not just for everybody else. I want it to be a better place for myself.
What was there, as a child in that sort of area, it was a rural type sounding small town, what was there to do as a youngster?
Well, what all young people did in the 50s and early 60s, you know, we actually played games. We went outside and played cowboys and Indians around the pine trees, you know. We used to take the Barbie doll and torture her. I never didn't like her then, don't like her now. But we did kids' games, kickball. I used to play jump rope. I still used to be good at it till my knees got shot. But, you know, normal kid games. And I read like a fiend. I've been a bookworm since I could first learn to read.
Now, you didn't really know what you wanted to do when you grew up at the time, did you? Did you have any ideas, though?
I wanted to be an Egyptologist. It's the only thing my father ever said, you can't do that.
Why?
It's ridiculous. If I'd wanted to, he would have supported it. He just thought it was a ridiculous thing. I mean, ridiculous in the sense of how can you make a living as an Egyptologist? I also wanted to be a veterinarian. It's harder to get into vet school, though, than medical school.
That's right.
At least at that time it was.
Still is, I think.
Yeah.
Now, you did become an activist fairly young. I mean, you were still quite young during the Vietnam War.
I was
and
at
you were
university.
Out there. Right, and you were out there.
A little, you know, I wasn't SDS or the Weather Underground. You know, my first foray into protesting U.S. policy was going to the state capitol in Vermont, and you know, a whole bunch of us, and holding up placards in the gallery around where the legislators were, calling upon them to pass a resolution telling the U.S. to get out of the war. And of course, I felt the ferment of the time. I mean, it wasn't just Vietnam, it was civil rights, it was the reemergence of the women's movement. It was, if I'm allowed to say this, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was all of those changes. And I went from being the good girl who always got her homework in a month before it was due to a college hippie, you know? But I still didn't know what I wanted to be.
And you were studying courses that would get you to teach English as a second language.
That was a master's degree after undergraduate. I changed my degree, my focus 5 times during undergraduate. Ended up in psychology, but you can't do anything with a bachelor's degree in psychology. And it really wasn't until the 80s, Central America work, where I got handed a little brochure about El Salvador and other Vietnam with a question mark. And if it had not had the juxtaposition of Salvador and Vietnam, I would have thrown it away. But I couldn't imagine, I just couldn't see what the linkage was. And it was it was announcing a meeting where a representative of the Salvadoran Democratic Front was going to come and speak on, what the U.S. government was doing with our tax dollars in their teeny country. And I expected Che Guevara, and I was hoping he'd be hot, I have to admit. He was cute enough, but he was not Che Guevara. He was in a 3-piece pinstripe suit. He had actually gone to UCLA, but his father was one of the murderous generals from El Salvador. And he was an incredibly charismatic speaker, and the next thing I knew, I was handing out those cheesy little mimeographed brochures, trying to educate, people in the U.S. about the ongoing intervention by the United States around the world. And I've been struggling with the U.S. ever since, which is another reason I'm considered controversial.
Where did the landmines come into the picture?
It was 1991, the end of the year. I was in intense burnout from working on Central America, El Salvador and Nicaragua for a decade. And I'd actually gone to a job counselor to try to find a straight job. It was a disaster. We sit, and she's looking at me and saying, well, could you talk about the work you've done? And I said, well, war in El Salvador, wounded children in El Salvador, Sandinistas, the counter-revolution. And by the end of it, you can imagine, her eyes were spinning. And she just looked at me and she said, oh, I'm going to have to think about this for quite some time to see if I can mainstream you. We knew we'd never speak again. I was actually saved from being mainstreamed by Bobby Mueller, the executive director of the Vietnam Vets for America Foundation, and a guy named Thomas Gebauer from a humanitarian group in Germany. And they corralled me into a meeting at Bobby's office over the weekend, right around the U.S. Thanksgiving time. And they started talking about this prosthetics clinic that they had opened in Cambodia. And they were training former soldiers from the various Cambodian factions during the fighting there to manufacture prosthetic limbs for other victims. And they decided very quickly that that was not going to solve the problem. You could make prosthetics till the end of time. If you didn't get rid of these weapons that were in the ground for generations after the end of fighting, you would never solve the problem. And they thought I was a reasonably competent organizer, so they asked if I would take it on. They take on the possibility of a political campaign of non-governmental organizations to pressure governments to ban landmines. And since I was looking for an out of Central America.
And your careers advisor.
and my advisor did not function properly for me. And it also seemed really fascinating to me. It took about 3 seconds to understand the difference between a landmine, which stays in the ground forever after battle, and a gun that goes home with the soldier. But I also saw that you could use that as a prism to make people understand the long-term impact of conflict, of war, and that, you know, peace is not simply an absence of armed conflict. It's equality in the society. It's a more equal distribution of resources in the world. It's everything this world is not doing now.
Let me ask you one thing. Though. Seeing what happens to victims of landmines, there's incredible trauma. Emotionally, how did you cope with this barrage of suddenly the experience of what landmines do?
To be honest, I had learned dissociation, you know the psychological term, dissociation, from years of dealing with my violent brother. You know, my sister, who was a psych nurse at one point, said to me, "You need to get, you know, in touch with your inner emotions about this." And I said, "Mary, Mary, Mary, I've become a competent activist in the world, and part of my competence comes from being able to step back emotionally and still strategize and, you know."
That helped then?
Yeah. My sister would disagree, but I don't care. I love her dearly, but I love it sometimes. It makes it easier.
And the campaign went from literally a handful of people to a massive group. And tell me about that growth and how it happened. What triggered that?
Well, we went from the two organizations, Muller's Vets and Medico International in Germany, so I could call it the International Campaign, and a staff of one, which was me. It was ridiculous. It's not magic. And when I say that, people look at me like I'm nuts. And I might be nuts, but it's not magic. I immediately started thinking about what organizations have done anything related to landmines, what organizations haven't thought about it, but their work actually touches on landmine communities, et cetera, et cetera. And I, you know, set up meetings and went and talked to them and put out the problem and asked if they would be interested in participating in the campaign. And every single one I went to said yes. If somebody else starts it, we'll get involved. And we used, I think, a very, well, not very novel, but very open structure. There was no, you know, executive director titles. My sole function was coordinating. I made sure that everybody in every country who worked on it knew what the other people were doing. Because as we know, information is power.
It must have been a huge vindication in 1997 when the campaign and yourself got that Nobel Peace Prize. What went through your head?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, 3 weeks before, the treaty language had been successfully negotiated. 90 countries that had participated had staved off a serious attempt by the Clinton administration to gut the treaty. And we emerged with a simple, elegant document that completely banned landmines. First time a conventional weapon that had been used by fighting forces all over the world for almost 100 years was banned. That was the most amazing day of my life, in all honesty. It was like, holy moly, these people are listening. We were able to generate enough pressure because we worked together with one goal, not always loving each other, but we kept our eyes on the goal of getting rid of the weapon. And because we did, we convinced governments to do what they should have done anyway. It was absolutely awesome. The Peace Prize has been hugely important to the ongoing work of the campaign. We went from 90 countries who had participated in the negotiating to 122 who went and signed. And all of us believe it was, you know, partly the influence of the Peace Prize.
You got the recognition. In 2004, Forbes magazine had you as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world as well. And I wonder, when you look at these successes, how do they contrast with the low moments? What were the most challenging things you faced?
The Landmine Campaign, honestly, and I've pondered this a lot. We've written a couple of books about it. You know, how the different elements of the partnership that brought about the treaty, you know, how we worked together to make it happen. And we just did another one on the first 10 years of the life of the treaty and why it is successful. And it's because the campaign is still there bugging the governments to do what they're supposed to do. Compared to Central America work, which was tough, you were labeled a communist because, of course, that was where Al Haig and, you know, Reagan had drawn the line against communism. And it was on-the-ground tough stuff. The Landmine Campaign, it was partly the moment in time, too. It was right after the, you know, Berlin Wall fell. people believed there could be change, and we were giving them a mechanism to actually, prove that peace was possible. Get rid of this weapon, prove something. And it was fantastic. I could never do it again. I'd like to do it with killer robots, as a matter of fact. I'm very agitated. Well, drones are the tip of the iceberg. The US is doing a huge amount of research to build weapons that need no human in the loop, so that humans will then be at the service of the technology that will go out and decide when and who to kill. I find that absolutely terrifying.
Well, if we have robots fighting each other, it's not so bad.
Yeah, but imagine the havoc they would wreak on the world. I just think it's, well, look at the drones in Pakistan, Yemen. They've been used in Somalia. I think it's horrifying.
Who have been your mentors in life, Jody?
I've been fighting with my editor. I'm writing a memoir, as I mentioned earlier. There's a little bit that I want to stay in. My sister, Mary Beth, the one I mentioned before, used to say to me when we were really, young, if you could be anybody, who would you want to be? And of course, she wanted to be some Hollywood, like Annette Funicello or somebody. And I never could answer her anything but, I only want to be me. And of course, she thought I was a boring twit. But it was really true. I thought it was so difficult to figure out who I was and how I was going to be in the world that, trying to be somebody else or think about emulating somebody else seemed like a struggle.
Role models apart, though, people who actually were a positive influence on your life in that
My dad, my mom, my grandparents, Ralph and Anna B. The people who inspire me the most, always. And I adore, the Archbishop and His Holiness. We're good friends. They've obviously done outstanding things in the world. But the ones that make me get up and keep doing this work when I want to quit sometimes are the people that nobody knows their name, and every day they really put their lives on the line. Like some of the women human rights defenders these days in Mexico, that place is in chaos. And they still go out and confront that government and, the military that are willing to rape and kill and pillage and burn.
It's the unsung heroes.
It's the unsung heroes. I love them.
Well, in 2006, you formed the Nobel Women's Initiative with a bunch of fantastic people, Nobel laureates.
Yes.
What was the idea behind that?
Actually, Shirin Ebadi from Iran and I were in Nairobi for a big landmine conference in December of 2004. That might have been the end of November. And we were just chatting, and she said, right now there are 7 women alive with the Peace Prize. Shouldn't we somehow, come together to use the influence and access we have to support the work of other women around the world working for peace with justice and equality? And I thought it was a fantastic idea. It doesn't mean that we don't do our own individual things that we do, but when the participation or support of the Nobel women really does make a difference to the work of somebody else or some organization, we are willing to go in and help. We did help in a very serious case in Mexico, as a matter of fact, helping get 12 political prisoners freed.
What has it taught you? What do you think is the biggest lesson you've learned from all this?
That anybody in the world can make a difference. And that to do it, all you have to do is get up off the chair and start. Worrying about changing the world does nothing for anybody, and it can make you neurotic, like my Italian Catholic mother. Worry without action is really a waste of time. It just takes getting up, finding a handful of people who share your views, sitting down with them and figuring it out, and recognizing that you're not going to resolve all of the problems of the world. No one will. But if each of us deals with the one we care the most about, we can together change the world. We can make it a world based on human security, not national security. We can make it a world where there's relative equality. I'm not a Pollyanna who believes that, someday I'm going to wake up and share billions of dollars with the billionaires in the world. But I do know and I do believe that there can be equality before the law, there can be basic education for everybody, there can be basic health care for everybody, and I'm not talking about the health care debate in the United States.
It shouldn't be that difficult, should it?
No, it should not.
Now, in terms of legacy, though, if you're going to be remembered a certain way, what would you like it to be?
A grassroots activist who stayed one her entire life.
Jody Williams, I wish you a lot of luck. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was fun.